Hi, and welcome to the 52nd in our Middle Eastern Islamic history series, focusing on the formation of Saudi Arabia. This is actually the first time that we've been back to the Arabian Peninsula since episode 6. So it's really exciting to come back here in earnest. We have touched on events in the Arabian Peninsula, like some stuff in Oman, some stuff in Yemen once or twice, but to really do an episode here, we haven't done that. So that's part of the excitement. But before we get to that excitement, we need to go over the rules for those who are unfamiliar. And the first thing is that this is not an academic presentation. I am not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we will be discussing today. I'm a lawyer by training, and I am just somebody who's really excited and interested about these things, and I hope that you are too. I try to give my presentation in a secular manner, not trying to prejudice or be in favor of any particular religious or political opinion. That said, of course, this is the history of a very religious region, and so we're going to see that periodically. Now, of course, given the sensitivity of this topic, like all the topics in the Middle Eastern history series, let's be respectful, but I do love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in due course. What I like to say is that my presentations, my classes are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you know something, I'll probably tell you something you didn't know. The next thing is that I like to have what I call a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that at 9 o'clock Eastern time, if I haven't gotten to any slides, I won't get to those slides this time. They'll just roll over into the next presentation. And that way, you know that I respect your time and you respect my time in the sense of there will be no more new material. That said, if we're having a discussion, if we have questions, that'll be fantastic. We'll continue with those. When I put dates below a person's name, those dates are their years of service, not their lifespan. Although, admittedly, in the case of some officials, it very well could be their lifespan. And this, like the other 51 entries into the Middle Eastern Islamic History series and all the other series we have at History, mostly ancient discussions, they will be recorded that you can watch them later, and you can find those recordings on our YouTube channel. Of course, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we do appreciate PayPal donations, managing Meetup, managing Zoom, managing YouTube. All these things cost money. And so we really appreciate being able to give you this content. Of course, it's free and it will continue to be free, but those donations are appreciated. All right. So one of the things that I've sort of teased at throughout this series, but never really concretized, is something that I wanted to concretize here, which is the concept of modernity. When we talk about modernity in political science, we're talking about a different state of affairs than existed in the medieval period, and that different state of affairs primarily is concentrated with what's called the monopoly of power, that there's a sovereign in a country, and that sovereign has effective control over all forms of power. The police respond to them, the military responds to them. There's no autonomous regions except those delegated that power from the capital city. And so one of the things that we've noticed over the course of the series is, for example, the Ottoman Empire or Iran struggling with the concept of modernity over the course of several centuries, right? During the 19th century, in the Ottoman Empire, you had the changes of Mahmud II, where we talked about the Vilayat Nizam Nemesi, the reorganization of the provinces, which resulted in the new censuses, which resulted in the new conscription, all these different things that slowly led us into a modern state. When we saw Iran, we saw things like Nadir Shah, who in the 18th century was able to coalesce Iran into a modern state. But the majority of participants in that, as soon as he died, reverted back to sort of a more medieval structure. And Iran didn't return to a modern state structure until last week's discussion of Reza Khan, when he re-centralized Iran by defeating all the different local groups that have been empowered since the beginning of the Qajar period, right, in the beginning of the 19th century. So we've got this situation where we have medieval states and modern states in a slow progression in the case of the Ottoman Empire and Iran. When it comes to the Arabian Peninsula, it's like a switch has been flipped. And what ends up happening is that we have modern states replacing medieval states in the course of decades, not centuries. And so it's incredibly quick how these changes occur. And there's a few things that I wanted to point out about the differences between modernity and medieval states. So, as I said, in modernity, the power is concentrated in the hands of the sovereign, right? In the case of the United States, for example, right, the power is concentrated in Washington, D.C. That is the federal power. Now, there's the Constitution, which creates a power sharing arrangement between the government in D.C. and the several states. But at the end of the day, power ultimately flows up to the government in Washington, D.C., and it's not as if, for example, a state can mobilize its own forces against those of the national government. The closest we ever came to that, right, was the situation with the Little Rock Nine, right, where you had that fight between federal and state power manifest in an actual physical altercation. But that's really not something that's contested within this forum. Within the medieval state, you have the sovereign who exists in the capital city, and that sovereign has a relationship with the nobles or leaders of the local regions, the governors of the local regions. And it may be the case that the governors are responsible for internal policy and send taxes up to the sovereign. Maybe it's that the sovereign is able to intervene and build military facilities in the region, but not directly affect local policy. Maybe it's they can affect local policy, but they can't organize the people for military conscription. There could be a lot of different relationship qualia, but at the end of the day, those leaders in the local regions have the power to do whatever they want in a way that they don't have in a modern state. And so a lot of these other pieces fall into place. I have a comment that it's like a distributed feudal system. It's exactly what it is. A feudal system is a medieval state, right? And so one of the things that has bedeviled Arabia for much of the 20th century is that because there was this quick shift from medieval states to modern states, the borders of these states are not entirely clear. In a medieval state, you don't exactly have borders as a line in the sand that you can draw quite easily to distinguish one territory from another. In truth, control is sort of like a dimmer switch. You have more control closer to the capital city, less control further away from a capital city. And of course, there is some flexibility with that degree, depending on the relationship that the sovereign has with the various governors or nobles that exist in the various provinces. So you can have a province that's physically distant, but if the governor is very loyal, then the power extends further. Or you could have a region that's very close as the crow flies, but because it's in a mountainous region or an arid desert region, and the local governor is not as reliable to the sovereign, it can actually be an area of weak control, and where the borders functionally in that region are much closer. So one of the things that we'll see is that many of the shapes of the countries, and perhaps you may notice it as well, in the Arabian Peninsula have straight lines for borders. And that's not an accident. That's because they didn't have borders until they had to have borders. And the other aspect that we're going to see is that the relationship between religion and a state changes when we move from a medieval state to a modern state. So in a medieval state, the religious backing to a state confers legitimacy upon the state, right? The ruler is legitimate because he is the servant of insert religion here. In Europe, for example, that used to be the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church would crown the various kings of Europe, and you couldn't hold the title of king if you weren't crowned by the Pope. That's why the ruler of Lithuania, who was a polytheist until the middle of the 14th century, had the title of Grand Duke, because he could never accede to the title of king. He wasn't backed by the Catholic Church. Conversely, in a modern state, generally the legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed. This is one of the primary concepts of liberal democracy, but even in places without liberal democracy, like, for example, Putin's Russia right now, or Saddam Hussein's Iraq when that existed, or China, the People's Republic of China as it currently exists. In all these cases, even these rulers will legitimate their right to rule from the consent of the governed, that they are the best representatives of the governed people, that they're governing in the interest of the governed people, and they don't claim that religion is their backing. So it frees the government of a modern state to exercise a degree of control or restraint against religion that medieval states really don't have access to. And so we're going to see states increasingly in Arabia have to grapple with this division between religion and political power as they become more and more modern. So another thing that I wanted to do to sort of get us into the space of where we are is just sort of to orient ourselves in terms of the geography of the region, because the geography of the region at the beginning of the 20th century is quite different from the geography of the region now in terms of the specific states that exist. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is along the west coast, along the Red Sea, is the state of Hejaz. And we're going to talk a lot about the state of Hejaz. That's the state where Mecca and Medina, the Islamic holy sites, are located. You can see Mecca in the circle. On the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia today, what's on the Persian Gulf, you can see Al-Ahsa or Al-Hassa. Both pronunciations are correct. And this is the region of what is today Saudi Arabia that touches the Persian Gulf, both because it is a seaside region and because it has a large Shiite population. It is culturally distinct from the other areas of the Arabian Peninsula. Between the Hejaz and Al-Aqsa is the region called Nejd, of which the capital is Riyadh. You can see Riyadh in that circle. And the region of Nejd exists sort of in the dead center of the Arabian Peninsula. Above, to the northwest of Nejd, is the region of Jabal Shamar, whose capital city is Al-Ha'il. I don't know why Al-Jawf is circled. I probably should fix that. But Al-Ha'il is the capital of Jabal Shamar, that northern region of Saudi Arabia. And so we have this situation of numerous contingent parts. We also have, for example, if we look to the southwest of the Hejaz, we have Asir. Yemen, of course, is divided into multiple different statelets, and we're going to talk about that when we get to Yemen. Oman has roughly the same shape that it has today, but you can see that there's two different Omans. There's the sort of the brown one that follows the coast, and the yellow one that's further inland. We're going to discuss those two. The brown one along the coast is the Sultanate of Oman, and the yellow one is the Imamate of Oman. And then, of course, you have what today you would recognize as the United Arab Emirates, which at that time is defined as the Trucial States, and we'll discuss what that relationship is. So I wanted to sort of orient us. And I have a question. It seems that in many regions over time, there's a repeating tension between religious legitimacy and political legitimacy, as is painfully happening in the US again now, among other places, although I expect many Americans don't perceive it that way. I would say I agree. That's definitely something to take into account. But I wouldn't say that, even for very religious Americans, that they would say that the evangelical church would confer legitimacy on the United States. There is this sort of view that Jesus handed out the Constitution, but as a fundamental thing, they believe that the government should be a reflection of the consent of the governed. They just think that they're the ones who should be consented, whose consent should be sought, not the entire population of the United States, which includes numerous, quote, liberals, end quote, who disagree with their policies. I have another question. Is the entire country flat and surrounded by desert? Are there mountains or any natural defense structures? Absolutely, there are mountains. The entire length of the Hejaz, especially along the Red Sea, is very mountainous, and those mountains continue all the way from the Gulf of Aqaba, which is that small sliver of water that separates the Sinai Peninsula from the Hejaz in the north, and it continues all the way to Taiz in the south of Yemen, right, all along the coast. And in fact, as we discussed in episode 3 of the series, these mountains face towards the Red Sea in the sense that their windward side is towards the Red Sea. And so those areas along the coast are actually areas where you can put up dams, aggregate water, and grow food, which is why, for example, Yemen, when it's not being bombed as it is now, is perfectly capable of growing its own agriculture. In terms of Oman, between the Imamate in yellow and the coastal region in orange, especially as if you're looking at that line that stretches east-west, there is a massive mountain range there as well. And in this case, the seaside is windward, and so the winds are coming from the other direction. Other than those mountains, there really are no major natural defenses to much of this land. There are hills and mountains. Sorry, there are hills periodically. It's not entirely flat. And that light beige area that's sort of in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, south of Nejd, is an area called Rub al-Khali, or the empty quarter, and that is just a gigantic sand desert, which, because of its size, is functionally impassable, especially in the pre-modern era. So that also serves as a barrier, even if it is not, strictly speaking, a mountain or a river. All right, so in order to understand where Saudi Arabia is coming from, we have to sort of understand a little bit about Abd al-Wahhab. And you can see Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab on the upper left-hand side. He was a new religious figure existing within the Arabian Peninsula. And he had lived in the city of Al-Uyaina, which you can see on the map is just inside the area of influence of the Banu Khalid, who controlled the area of Al-Aqsa. Now, Muhammad bin Abd al-Wahhab argued, and we're going to get into this argument a little bit more later, he argued that many of the practices that were going on in Arabia while he was alive were innovative practices. This is the Islamic concept of bid'ah. And bid'ah, or innovation, is this idea that the way that things are being done is not the way that the Prophet wanted them done. And accordingly, you have all these traditions that have seeped into the behaviors and practices of the people that are not how they, in theory, should be. And within the city of Uyaina, Abd al-Wahhab saw many aspects of, and it's worth pointing out that Abd al-Wahhab had a perfectly good education. He went to Mecca. He was familiar with several different strains of fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. So when he comes to these ideas, he's not coming to these ideas as somebody who doesn't know anything. He sees many of the practices among the Arabs of Uyaina, and argues that these practices are against the traditional teachings of Islam. The first one is the veneration of people. In many parts of the Islamic world, Saudi Arabia was not unique in this, and certainly not unique in this now. There were shrines and tombs of important personages in Islamic history, and these shrines would be visited periodically by Muslims as a place to offer prayer, hoping that the qualities of these historic personages would vest within them, right? In this case, there in Al-Uyaina was the tomb of Zayd bin al-Khattab. If that surname sounds familiar, it probably should. He's the older brother of Umar bin al-Khattab, the second caliph in Islam. And so Zayd was buried in Al-Uyayna, and was a frequent place that people would go in order to venerate him and venerate his attributes. Now, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab considered this kind of act a violation of the oneness of God. And it was an association of partners with him. This sin is called shirk. And so he asked the leader of Al-Uyayna to demolish the shrine, and he did. He also saw that people were venerating a certain palm tree, which they called the most glorified of all trees. And so he literally took out an axe and hacked the tree down. And the final aspect, which really got the attention of the leader of the Banu Khalid, who is Sulaiman bin Muhammad bin Khurayr, well, the last act was stoning. He found a woman who was adulterous and argued that the traditional Muslim punishment for adultery is stoning, and therefore this woman should be taken and stoned. And that's exactly what happened. Now, stoning was not something that was delegitimized prior to Abdul Wahhab, but it was something that was not commonly practiced. It was simply something that was what was called an al-had, or at the extremis type of punishment. And so in most cases, the local people didn't find the need to go to that extremis. But with all these activities, Sulaiman bin Muhammad bin Ghurayr basically told the leader of Al-Uyayna that Abdul Wahhab was not welcome within any territory where he had sufficient control, because many of these traditions were very important to the Arabian people. And in many ways, Abdul Wahhab was a reformer. And his reforms, in their view, were a violation of the tradition of what Islam had been. And so it's worth discussing a little bit about what that means. So Abdul Wahhab's philosophy basically came from a little bit of what we said before. And he summed up this problem as in the problem of taqlid, or the problem of tradition. And as that cartoon sort of demonstrates, in Abdul Wahhab's view, those who followed the taqlid, or tradition, of the elders were simply following those elders into improper belief, right? They're all going right to hell because they're all doing the same thing wrong. And so what Muslims need to do is engage with the text on their own, and exclusively those texts, the basic texts of the faith, the Quran, the Sirah, which is the biography of the Prophet, and the Hadith, which are the sayings about the events that took place in Muhammad's life. So, but that's not what Islam was by this point. Most of what was going on at this point came out of the process of fiqh, or Islamic jurisprudence. So you start with the Quran and the Sunnah, but then you go to a process called ijtihad. And ijtihad is the process of examining these texts and trying to apply them to present-day situations. It may be the case that the text permits a certain behavior, but that behavior is only supposed to be permitted under certain circumstances. And the scholars delineated over the course of centuries what those would be. In order to perform this process of ijtihad, they would usually perform a process of qiyas, or analogizing. So they would say this, for example, the Quran prohibits the consumption of khamar, or wine, but it doesn't prohibit the consumption of other alcohols. So there was the process of analogizing. What was the intent of the Quran to prohibit wine? Does it apply similarly to beer? Does it apply similarly to vodka? And the majority of scholars have said, yes, it does. There are some scholars who disagree. There are a small minority, but they do exist. But this process of analogizing is how you move from what the Quran says literally to how does a person who is a Muslim apply this in their day-to-day life. The next thing that the mujtahids, those who are performing ijtihad, the mujtahids would do was what was called ijma', which was when you came together as a group to achieve consensus, right? As I said, the analogizing aspect or qiyas can result in different answers for different people. But the community should follow one behavior, so you don't have multiple different behaviors in the same community. So that's where ijma came in, to sort of unify the Muslims under one set of common behaviors. Now, this process is still done today by most traditional Muslim scholars or neo-traditional Muslim scholars. They go to the Quran and the Sunnah and the Sirah. They perform their act of ijtihad by using qiyas and ijma in order to perform analysis on modern situations. A perfect example of this is, how do people in Iceland, because Muslims now live in Iceland, how do Muslims in Iceland celebrate Ramadan, right? And there's a huge problem, because if you are in one of the 6 months of a year where the sun rises for about an hour before it sets, well, then Ramadan isn't really a fast. So it doesn't really mean anything. And if you are very unfortunate and Ramadan falls in one of the 2 months where the sun doesn't set, then you're in an even worse problem, because you can't eat at all for a month, and that would result in you dying. So, right, so the scholars went back and they said, okay, so what is this situation like? How do we evaluate this case? What do we do? And the scholars came to different answers, but those answers coalesced around 3 different ones. One is you use the times from Mecca, you just apply them to your time zone. Another one was that you actually try to match the sunrise and sunset. And the third was that you choose a place along your latitude, along your longitude, but at 25 degrees north latitude. So those were different attributes. Now, there's a question here of whether the more extreme practices of Islamic punishments that we see today are related to Wahhabism. I would say in most aspects, yes. That's not to say that actually, let me take that back. It depends on the manifestation of that violence. So if we're talking about the large-scale executions that are occurring in Muslim countries, public flogging, these kinds of things, generally speaking, it's the influence of Wahhabism, and that influence can even be felt in Shiite countries because of the way that it influenced Vilayat al-Faqih, or the underlying ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But in many cases, we have many acts of extremists. The first one that comes to my mind is honor killings that are performed by individuals in communities, not by the political power. And in those cases, it's very rarely Wahhabism that's promoting this. It's traditional beliefs about how Islam should be manifest. It's that taqlid that exists in these other countries. And that taqlid can be religiously justified, and it can also be not religiously argued against in many cases. FGM is another great example, right? And this is one where Muslim scholars are usually on the side of the anti-FGM advocates, primarily because FGM is not required by Islamic scripture. It may be permitted in certain instances, but it's not required. When Abdul Wahhab was expelled from Uyayna, he came to the city of Dar'iyya, which was not that far away, but it was outside of the influence of the Banu Khalid. And when he was there, he met Muhammad bin Saud al-Muqrin, who you can see in the center there. Muhammad bin Saud had a legitimacy problem. Most of the leaders of large areas in the Arabian Peninsula claim some sort of descendancy from Muhammad. And in many cases, that was what many Arabians believe gifted a person the right of kingship. Unfortunately, bin Saud didn't have this. His family was more or less irrelevant in the 7th century. So he needed a way to confer legitimacy on his person. At the same time, Abdul Wahhab needed a place where he could preach and proselytize and not be subject to violence, as he would have been if he stayed in Uyayna. And so in 1745, the two men sat together and they signed what was called the Charter of Dar'iyah. And the charter really solidified the relationship between these two persons. It argued that the Sultan was responsible for the affairs of state. He would organize the state. He would lead the Islamic nation. He would decide whether the country went to war or not. He would be responsible for defending the citizens. And on the flip side, Abdul Wahhab would have certain responsibilities as well. He would be the one who would give religious legitimacy to al-Muqrin's rule. He would also be the one to lead the religion in the country. Wahhabism would be the official religion of the state of Dar'iyah. He would be responsible also for educating the next generation. And of course, in the first Saudi state, that's less important than as Saudi Arabia continues to evolve and grow. And of course, through his intercession with God, it would be the job of Abdul Wahhab to improve the economy. And of course, intercession with God could also mean physical acts of violence and raiding. So in terms of the education, we can already see by the early period that we have what's called the Usula Thulatha, Asula Thulatha, or the three fundamentals, which was a common pamphlet that Abdul Wahhab distributed throughout Dar'iyah. And his view encapsulated the way that Muhammad bin Saud al-Muqrin began to go about policy. The first thing that was established by Usul al-Thulatha is that rebellion and dissent from any of Muhammad bin Saud al-Muqrin's edicts was actually an act of sin. So you couldn't have legitimate dissent against his rule. He was the ruler in all ways. Another aspect was that it was legitimate for these parties to expand the religion. And in so doing, a number of raiding parties were assembled together, which expanded the borders of the emirate substantially. As you can see, Dar'iyah and the area that al-Muqrin controlled originally is in that dark green hue. But by the end of his life, there's that medium green hue of all those territories that were at least nominally under his control. And then the lighter green is his successors. Now, it's worth pointing out, right, again, this goes back to the borders and modern states and all of this, that these are the borders of those tribes of Arabians that paid honor or homage or paid tribute to al-Muqrin. It's not necessarily the case that he appointed a governor in these regions, but they decided that they would rather be on the side of the Bedouins doing the raiding than the Bedouins being raided. And over time, Wahhabism became established in many of these communities because of being under Dar'iyah's power. This came to a head in 1802 when you began to have these Bedouin raiding camps becoming more and more zealous in their activities. And in particular, right, the Wahhabis, they felt that the Sunnis around them were wrong for continuing to follow the taqlid, continuing to follow the tradition, and that they were following rules that were inappropriate. That said, they felt that the Shiites were significantly more wrong. The Sunnis had some things wrong, but the Shiites were certainly beyond acceptable. And lo and behold, at the northeastern edge of Dar'iyah's control was a large Shiite population, the population of southern Iraq. And that population um, becomes especially voluminous because there are two holy sites in the south of Iraq for Shiites. And these are pilgrimage sites only for Shiites, not for Sunnis. And those are the cities of An-Najaf and Karbala. In particular, the shrine of Imam Hussein, Muhammad's grandson, is in Karbala. And it's a pilgrimage site for Shiites who consider him a rightful ruler who was denied his place because of history. For those of you who are really interested in that conflict, I believe I discussed it in episode 4. If not, then episode 5. So this sort of was the intersection point of two things that the Wahhabi educated Bedouin despised: Shiite religious practice and the practice of venerating historic personages. And so they attacked the shrine and they sacked it in 1802, stealing a lot of its treasures and killing a number of the penitent worshippers. This led to the Ottoman Empire launching a war against the state of Dir'iyah. The troops of Mahmud II, who was Ottoman Sultan at the time, Selim III, who was Ottoman Sultan at the time, went into the region to try and liberate Mecca, because Mecca very quickly came under the control of Dir'iyah after Karbala was sacked. But given the desert conditions that existed near Mecca, and given the paucity and the number of troops that that the Ottomans could send, the Ottomans actually lost the engagement with Dir'iyah. Accordingly, they ordered their Egyptian vassal, Muhammad Ali Pasha, and to if you want to follow up on that relationship, I would recommend going to episode 30. But Muhammad Ali Pasha was tasked, because he had developed a more modern army, to remove Dir'iyah. And so he had one false start invasion, and then he let his eldest son, Ibrahim Pasha, led a proper invasion in 1813, arriving on the coast, the Red Sea coast of what's today Saudi Arabia, and taking Mecca back from Dir'iyah. He began to press further inward towards the capital city of Dir'iyah, because Dir'iyah is both the name of the emirate and the capital. And as he was getting closer, in 1815, the Dir'iyans reached out and a truce was struck. But Ibrahim Pasha was very suspicious of this truce, and so were the Dir'iyans. So they built a number of fortresses further inland, and as they were building these fortresses, Ibrahim Pasha violated the ceasefire and went further. And it's not only that he violated the ceasefire. Starting at the city of Hanaqiyah, which was the last city that he was able to control before the ceasefire went into effect, he went from town to town and massacred the indigenous population. When he finally got to the city of Ad-Dar'iyah, he besieged the city, and despite its defenders putting up a valiant defense, it was simply a numbers game and also a modernity game. Ibrahim Pasha was using modern European weapons, drill tactics, and he had numbers an order of magnitude larger than the Dir'iyan defendants. In many cases, when we're talking about the battles that are taking place in the Arabian Peninsula, we're talking about people in the hundreds, not maybe sometimes a few thousand. So when the Egyptians marched up with about 10,000 soldiers, they were in a significantly better position. Now, when Ibrahim Pasha burnt Dir'iyah to the ground, he first had the king, Abdullah bin Saud, deported back to Constantinople, where he was imprisoned and later executed. imprisoned, and he died in imprisonment. And while several royals from Muqrin's house were similarly deported, real ire was for the Wahhabi clerics who continued to operate in that region throughout the length of the Emirate of Dar'iyah. Sulaiman bin Abdullah al-Sheikh was executed by firing squad, but not until he had been forced to listen to the lute. One of the Wahhabi arguments was that the listening to music was one of these bid'ah, one of these innovations, and it was not permitted for Muslims to make or listen to music. And so the captors intentionally played music for him as a show of their disagreement with his Islamic position. It's also worth dwelling on Sulaiman bin Abdullah al-Sheikh for a second longer, because he is, in his own way, an innovator within the Wahhabi space. Of course, the Wahhabis wouldn't argue that he is an innovator, but that's their prerogative. When I say that he innovated, I mean that he created new doctrines that hadn't existed before in Wahhabism. And they have antecedents, but the doctrine itself was new. And it was this. For the first time, Wahhabis had permission to argue that Muslim states and Muslim rulers were themselves in violation of the requirements to be a legitimate Muslim ruler. So what does that mean? It means that Muslims can be declared to be non-Muslims by Wahhabis if they are behaving in such a way. What happens to them is what is called takfir. They are pronounced as a kafir, or an unbeliever. And through this act of takfir, they are delegitimizing any other group that may be adverse to their claims, regardless of the shared Muslim heritage. Now, there had been cases of Takfirism previously. We've talked about, for example, in episode 21, how the Safavids declared that anybody who wasn't Shiite was Takfiri. But this was the first time that a group that was ostensibly within the same sect of Islam, still Wahhabis consider themselves Sunni, was arguing that other people within their same group were disbelievers, and therefore it's permitted to conquer them, defeat them, and destroy their governments. The perniciousness of that issue was exactly what Ibrahim Pasha was trying to target here, to prevent that from spreading. As we know, he was not successful in this. A number of Wahhabi clerics managed to escape, and also during the length of the Emirates existing, which was roughly 60 years, nearly 70 years, whole generations have been brought up with this idea. And so in many of the nomadic communities, it became dominant. And this is sort of a map that shows the expansion of the Khedivate of Egypt, especially into Arabia. You can see how much territory was at least nominally under their control. And because of his actions in securing that territory, Muhammad Ali Pasha was able to add, for a certain amount of time, these regions of what is today Saudi Arabia to his domain. Now I want to pivot a little bit to Oman. The question is, so that's a major break from the traditional interpretation of the power of the sovereign in the Quran then. Very young then, only 200 to 300 years. Yes, the traditional interpretation of the power of the sovereign in the Quran is the view that the sovereign is to be constrained by the religious teachers, certainly, in terms of his moral and ethical conduct. But otherwise, as long as he is a Muslim in proper piety, the power vested is his. And it's not for other people to declare or not declare his legitimacy. Only learned scholars can say his actions were non-Islamic here, his actions were Islamic here, but no Muslim can take away another Muslim's Muslimness. Takfirism, especially as manifested by the Wahhabi, was absolutely new. And both in its radical democratization of the possibility of Takfirism and because of its manifest applicability. All right. So as we mentioned, first, the Portuguese on their way to India were trying to secure the sea routes, and then eventually the British would follow them. But the Portuguese fought a number of battles and had taken a number of fortresses along the Omani coast as their own territory in the 1500s. In the early 1600s, led by Nasir ibn Murshid, the Omanis rallied together against the Portuguese because of these abuses. There were numerous physical abuses as well as enslavement. And led by Nasir ibn Murshid, they established the Arab Sultanate of Oman. Now, the Omanis, it's worth taking a second to talk about this. The Omanis are a distinct sect within Islam. They are Ibadiyya. For those who are sort of curious again about the origins of Ibadiyya, I discussed it more in depth in episode 5. But because of this, they are neither Sunni nor Shiite. They exist as a third unrelated sect that formed at roughly the same time. The reason that most people don't talk about them is that there are about 3 million Ibadis in the whole world, compared to a Sunni population of over 1.6 billion. So after the Yarubids threw off the yoke of Portuguese control, they actually expanded their power radically. And because they were master boatsmen in terms of the construction and building of ships, they quickly expanded to the coast of Tanzania and Kenya. At that time, there had been a number of different townships along this area that had been engaged in Indian Ocean trade. What the Omanis did is they consolidated these under one empire, and even managed to expel the Portuguese from some of their areas in Africa, like Fort Jesus and Mombasa. And so Oman now becomes this multi-continental imperial state at its height. And there is a degree to which that's maintained, especially because of the slave trade coming from the island of Zanzibar. But the next time that Oman faces an enemy, it's from an internal civil war that expands outward. So Saif bin Sultan II is facing a fight for his future kingdom. And I talked about this more in depth in episode 46. He was fighting to control the dynasty, and the Persians led by Nadir Shah intervened on his behalf at his welcoming to put down his rivals. And the Persians, of course, who came in ended up pillaging the country, leading to an Omani resistance that coalesced along Ahmed bin Said al-Busaidi. He is the founder of the current dynasty that rules Oman, the al-Busaidi dynasty. He is able to overpower the Persians, force them to leave the country in 1753. And Oman returns to govern its multi-continental empire. Oman historically controlled the area on both what we say today is Oman and the area that we today call the United Arab Emirates. Although when we say control, we have to remember these are pre-modern states. So in many cases, right, the control is asserted through these relationships of tribute and control. Area of what we now consider the UAE, as I said, was part of that Omani tributary system, but the British called it the Pirate Coast. And the British called it the Pirate Coast because as they were entering and leaving the Persian Gulf, pirates, especially those affiliated with the Qasimi sheikhs, would attack his ships. Now, that is the British portrayal of the event. The Qasimis, who still exist today, those are the rulers of the emirates of Ras Al Khaimah and Sharjah in what is today the United Arab Emirates. So 2 of the 7 emirates are ruled by Qasimis. The Qasimi perspective on this is that they had a trade empire, and that trade empire was part and parcel of the larger Omani trade empire. And they had trade that extended from the Persian Gulf to India, which had been the historic domain of Omanis and other tribes affiliated with them. The British, trying to maximize their trade, saw these groups as a possible hindrance to that development. And so they were looking for excuses to get rid of them. One particular excuse, of course, was that these local ships levied tolls on those that tried to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is what separates the Persian Gulf from the Indian Ocean, right? So it's a very important choke point. You can see it to the northeast of the Musandam Peninsula. And the British saw these attempts to restrict their movement as acts of piracy. We have to understand also that Britain at this time existed sort of as 2 separate governments. There was the government in London, which was a civil government ruled by a parliament and the king/queen of England. And there was the British East India Company, which was a company. It had shareholders and owners and everything else. But one of the other things that it had was territory and an army. So from the perspective of other entities in the region, the British East India Company was a country. It did all the things that countries do. It assessed taxes. It had its own military specialists. It had its own diplomats. As we discussed with regards to Iran in episode, I want to say 39, when the British East India Company and the British government in London both sent ambassadors to Tehran, it was confusing to the Persians as to who the British were because they kept disagreeing with each other. So the British East India Company decided that they were going to stop the piracy, in their words, and they launched an invasion in 1809. The invasion in 1809 went south very quickly. The forts were relatively secure, and the number of men that had been sent was only a few thousand. So the local people of the states were able to defend themselves. In 1819, in alliance with the government of Oman itself, a number of military leaders and much more significant hardware were brought against Ras Al Khaimah, and Ras Al Khaimah was defeated. As a result of the defeat in that battle, the British compelled the several states, the several emirates or principalities along that coast to sign what was called the General Maritime Treaty of 1820. And the treaty was designed to prevent all forms of violence and warfare between the British and the various Arab principalities and between the various Arab principalities and each other. But the violence didn't cease, it only minimized. In 1835, with further gunboat diplomacy, the British compelled the signing of another agreement. This time, it would be a forced peace that would be managed by gunboats, and the Trucial States, which they came to be called because they were now organized by this truce. And the Trucial States discovered, actually, that when there's peacetime, they can go pearl diving. And that's much more lucrative for the economy. And so every year from 1835 until 1853, they kept renewing these annual agreements to keep peace between the various emirates. And then in 1853, they signed a permanent agreement that Britain would be the chief arbitrator in any disputes between them, and that they would be peaceful. They would no longer engage in what the British had termed piracy. So there's a question here of these Trucial States were mainly armed with rifles at that time. How did they conduct warfare against each other and the Europeans? Again, we have to remember that most battles in Arabia, even those conducted by Europeans, are being conducted with forces of 1,000 people to 10,000 people. So the low populations and the size of the local militaries is not really a hindrance, because on the battlefield, we're talking about roughly equal numbers. We're not talking about, 100,000 people land and they're facing, 1,000 people on the other side. Yeah, that'll be very quick, but that's not what's going on here. Additionally, with respect to piracy, the whole benefit was that it was hard to find them, right? They would sneak up quickly to the side of a ship. In the case of land-based siege, the Emiratis are the ones with the castles. So they're playing defensive, which is always easier if you're on the defensive side. And of course, they would import rifles from other European states. There were very few locally produced firearms. So while the Trucial States were being organized by the British, the Omanis experience a golden age. As I said, Said bin Sultan al-Busaidi was making arrangements with the British. And in fact, one of those arrangements was just after the General Maritime Treaty was signed. There was an Omani region in the easternmost part of the country, where the Bani Bu'ali were a local tribe, and they were resisting Omani rule. The Omani worked together with the British East India Company, particularly the Bombay sappers and miners, right? A significant number of Indians participated in these campaigns. In fact, the majority of the forces are Indian. And when I say the British, of course, I'm meaning in this case the British East India Company. Those two sides came together, and in 1821 routed the tribe such that they could no longer pose any threat to Said bin Sultan al-Busaidi. His relationship with the British East India Company, though, didn't start with the Trucial States. It started with the situation with Dar'iyah. Remember, if we go back to about 15 minutes ago, we were talking about how Dar'iyah was expanding, especially at the beginning of the 19th century. And they were expanding so far that they were entering Omani space and demanding tribute from the Omanis. And in 1808, Said bin Sultan al-Busaidi signed a treaty with Dar'iyah. But then in 1809, he decided that he wanted to reject it. And in order to reject it, he would need the power of a European state behind him, which is where the British stepped in. Now, the British and the French had both been trying to court Said's power, but ultimately it was British proximity as well as British assistance, which led the British to be the dominant power in Oman. And the British at this time were signing many exclusive treaties, meaning that if you signed a treaty with the British, you were not allowed to sign treaties with any other European power. And so this basically kept the French out. That said, Said bin Sultan wanted to expand his horizons as well as he could, and he had favorable relations with a number of American consuls that had visited him in Muscat and in Zanzibar. And so he sent out the Sultana, which was a large vessel filled with gifts to exchange and trade with the Americans. In fact, the Sultana was sent all the way from Zanzibar to New York Harbor, where Said bin Sultan's emissary became the first Arab emissary to arrive in a Western country. And his ship also was the first ship sent by an Arab country to arrive in the United States. Oman and the United States from that point on had a largely positive relationship, even though the relationship with Britain would remain the dominant relationship in Omani circles. When Said died, his empire was inherited by his two sons, Majid and Thawaini. But Majid and Thawani had a dispute over power, and accordingly, they couldn't divide the empire between each other. That said, the British had passed a number of laws during their relationship with Sultan Said. And among those was that they had the ability to arbitrate disputes between members of the Omani court. And so the two brothers sat down for a British-led arbitration, and the British decided that they had been governors of different territories of Oman during their lives, during the previous sultan's tenancy, and so therefore the two parts of the Omani Empire would be split. The African part would be given to one, and the European part would be given to, the Asian part would be given to the other. So what you end up having is that this multi-continental empire is broken up. And of course, this leads to a weakening of power for both sides, given the lack of easy trade that having a unified empire presented. The British became further and further involved with Oman, and of course, Muscat, because of its crucial position on Indian Ocean trade, became host to naval squadrons as early as the 1870s. Similarly, Britain has had a policy of banning slavery, and while the British hadn't enforced it previously, they began to request quite strongly that both the Sultanate of Zanzibar and the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman ban slavery in 1876. Now, neither of them did outright. In fact, Oman didn't make slavery illegal until 1970, but it severely lessened their slave trade that had existed, which was the dominant form of revenue generation for the Omanis prior to the discovery of oil in 1962. So during this 19th century period, the Omanis become more and more in debt, and that debt is more than happily financed by the British, who began writing loan after loan, and with those loans, using that as power to replace more and more officials in the Omani bureaucracy, such that by the time that we enter the beginning of the 20th century, you have Sultan Taimur bin Faisal, who rules from 1913 to 1932, and of his entire cabinet of 11 persons, only one of them, other than himself, is an Omani. Almost all the rest are British, including military officers, diplomatic officers, the treasury. All the major artifices of government of Oman are controlled by the British. Given this situation, there begins to be distance between the leaders of the Ibadi sect, the Imams, and the sultans of the Omani Sultanate, the Sultan of Oman and Muscat. Now, historically, the Sultan had himself been the Imam. The position was a religious and political shared position. But with this increasing Britishization, of Oman, many of the Imams, especially Salim bin Rashid al-Kharusi, began to feel that Oman was no longer a country of the Omanis. It had become something else. It had become a British satellite. And so he began a rebellion based in the city of Nizwa. And Nizwa has a fortress that has existed since the 18th century. It's an incredible site if you ever get to go to Nizwa Fortress. And you can see it there. Starting from Nizwa, he controlled the area in the interior of the country on the other side of that massive mountain range that separates Muscat from the coast, which is the Al-Hajar Mountains, literally the stone mountains. Despite having British advisors and a number of British soldiers, it was impossible between 1913 and 1920 for Sultan Timur to win any decisive victories against Imam Salim bin Rashid. And because of that, because he was unable to win any victories, he acceded to what was called the Treaty of Sib. And the Treaty of Sib divided Oman, at least politically, between the interior, which would be controlled by the Imam, and the part along the coast that would be controlled by Sultan Timur and his British acolytes, or rather by the British and his sultanic acolytes. In fact, even the city of Nakhal, which is on the windward side of the mountains, so closer to Muscat, fell into Salim bin Rashid al-Kharusi's hands. And in fact, this divide between the imamate internally and the coastal area would persist until the mid part of the 20th century. Now, remember that the Egyptians destroyed Diriyah in 1818, and they kept a garrison there for a while. But Turki bin Abdullah, who was one of the children of Abdullah ibn Saud, who was the exiled and the exiled monarch, he put together a coalition of different groups, and the Egyptians worked as best that they could to alert local leaders to avoid aligning with Turki bin Abdullah or face the wrath of the Egyptians. And many of them complied. The Qataris, for example, and the Kuwaitis did not support Turki bin Abdullah. But he found the Sudairi Bedouins, led by Suwaid bin Ali, and these Sudairi Bedouins aligned with Turki bin Abdullah, and they fought a battle to take control of Riyadh. Now, remember that the capital of the previous state had been Diriyah, but Diriyah had been pretty much demolished and razed to the ground. So Riyadh was very close physically to Diriyah, and it was still standing, so it could be made into a serviceable capital. And Turki bin Abdullah moved into Qasr al-Hukm, or the Palace of Rulership in Riyadh, and this actually became the footprint of the current rulership castle that exists today. But he began administering from there, and he began to fight expansionary wars. But he made one distinction that the previous Emirate of Diriyah leaders did not make. And that was that he entered into an agreement with the Ottoman Empire. He signed what was called a bay'ah. A bay'ah is sort of an agreement of sort of surrender to another state, an agreement of vassalage. And so he did this, and he performed the ceremony and the ritual. And accordingly, he refrained from attacking the Hejaz region, which was under the control of the Ottomans. Instead, he attacked further east, and he was able to supplement his forces with a number of former Arabians that had been previously jailed by the Egyptians, but were now being released. So doing that, he was able to build up his very modest administration. We're talking about administration of a few people. And he was able to extract bay'ah from many other leaders within the Arabian Peninsula. Now, at this point, it's worth noting that Egypt is actually stronger than the Ottoman Empire is. And we talked about this, I believe, in episode 28 or 31. But Egypt launched a war against the Ottoman Empire in 1831 to 1833 and almost took Constantinople. They were victorious at the Battle of Konya, and the Ottomans had to rely on Russian help, which, for those of you who are familiar with Ottoman-Russian relations, you'll understand when Mahmud II, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, said, "A sinking man even reaches for a viper." And the Russians were able to forestall Egypt's advance and get it to sign a peace treaty. In 1839, the Ottomans believed again that they could possibly take Egypt down. And so they started a war against the Egyptians. And the Egyptians met them at the Battle of Nezib. That battle was a loss for the Ottomans, a success for the Egyptians, which basically meant that the Ottoman Empire was in peril of collapsing under Egyptian power. Britain, which had taken a lot of energy in securing this line of states and regions on its way to India. We've talked about Oman, for example, today, and we're going to talk about Aden later. They didn't want the Ottoman Empire to collapse because then they felt like they might have to reestablish all of those lines and communications before, and the Ottoman Empire was effective at holding Russia back, and Russia, of course, was the enemy in the Great Game that we've talked about in several of the previous episodes. So in 1840, London is forced to, London compels Egypt to withdraw from its Ottoman imperial attack and to submit to a new peace treaty that would force them out of all territories east of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, in those last few years before this happened in 1838, Muhammad Ali sent another group to invade Najd. And that group marched at the head of a column. They had been expecting tribute from Turkey and his successors, like Mishari. But that money was not forthcoming. And so they felt that what would be better would be to remove the leader of the second, what we're going to call Saudi state, right? The first Saudi state was the Emirate of Diriyah. This is now the second Saudi state, the Emirate of Najd. And when they arrived, they instituted their own pretender to the throne, Khalid, and he remained in power for as long as the Egyptians were able to support him. But in 1840, because of this London Convention, Muhammad Ali Pasha and his money suddenly were no longer supporting them, which meant that power reverted to others within the structure, eventually falling to Abdullah bin Thunayan in 1841, right, 1 year later. And then we have this massive succession issue. It's not important to recognize all the names of the royalty in this period. What is important to realize is that it's many of the same people over and over again. And the reason that is because there were this massive disunity between the various factions of the royal house. And therefore, one person would remove the other, put them in jail or prison. Maybe they'd escape, maybe they'd run away, and then they'd take power later through a different coalition. And that's exactly what happens in this case. So we end up having a number of different issues that are accentuated by this struggle. The first is that many of the rulers need outside assistance to help them achieve power. And probably the most important of these clans from outside of the Saudi royal house is the Ar-Rashid house. In particular, Muhammad bin Abdullah Ar-Rashid actually will end the second Saudi state in 1891. The Rashidis were critical for securing Faisal bin Turki's return over Abdullah bin Thunayan. Another key thing that developed was that you begin to have British and French traders jockeying for influence with Najd because of its coastline in the Persian Gulf. Another major issue is that the Wahhabis, who had previously been aligned to monarchs per se, no longer felt that they were able to align with these monarchs, because if they chose the side in one of these internecine stripes and they chose the wrong one, well, the new emir would not respect those particular scholars, and to prevent those scholars from going from running extinct, what they decided to do is to support the monarchy itself, not any particular ruler. We also see during this period a massive lack of funds and massively small militaries and an infantile bureaucracy. In fact, at the height of the second Saudi state, there were two ministries, finance and diplomacy. Abdurrahman bin Faisal, as I mentioned earlier, was expelled by Muhammad Abdullah al-Rashid from Riyadh in 1891, and he went into exile with his son, Abdulaziz bin Abdurrahman Saud, who we're going to see a lot of later. So the demise of the Second Saudi State results in the ascendancy of the Rashidi clan and their state called Jabal Shamar. Now I'm going to pivot a little bit to Kuwait. So one of the interesting things, side notes in history, and we talked about this a little bit in episode 35, was that Karim Khan of the Zand, which was the ruling dynasty of Iran at the end of the 18th century, launched an invasion of southern Iraq. Now, that invasion was largely unsuccessful. Southern Iraq remained in the hands of the Georgian Mamluks, who were a vassal of the Ottomans, by the end of the war in 1779. But a lot of the war was around the city of Basra, which is Iraq's only port on the Persian Gulf. And so since Basra was under siege for 4 years, it was very difficult to do business there. And many merchants from Basra ended up making their way further south to Kuwait in order to work there and in order to continue making a livelihood. So this 4-year war ended up completely changing the fortunes of Kuwait. Kuwait became the shipbuilding capital of the Persian Gulf, outstripping even the Trucial States throughout the 19th century. And because of these merchants from Basra and merchants from all over the world who were using Kuwait as a port to enter the Ottoman Empire, usually from India, there were large numbers of international traders, Indians, Armenians, Jews, as well as the indigenous Arabian population. And that Arabian population would be led by Mubarak bin Sabah as-Sabah, and he would rule from 1896 to 1915. But how he came to rule is actually important to point out. He launched a double assassination of his brothers on the 8th of May, 1896. Now, there are debates among historians as to exactly how it was done, whether or not he ordered it directly, whether he participated, whether his sons participated as well. But the common consensus is that he was there with at least people loyal to him, his soldiers, to kill these two brothers and take power. After he did so, he requested that he be recognized as the Qaim Maqam. And the Qaim Maqam is the sort of governor of an Ottoman province. And he wanted that recognition from the Ottoman Empire so he could rule in their name. The Ottomans were reticent to give it to him in the fear that if they did so, they would incentivize other individuals who would be disposed to killing their own relatives to take power to do that. And that could be destabilizing for the empire. So what ends up happening is that Mubarak ends up turning to the British. And in 1899, his message to the British Command Center at Bushehr in Iran is received, and he is invited to sign the Anglo-Kuwaiti Treaty. This treaty recognizes Kuwait as a protectorate of the United Kingdom and gives it a significant number of and gives it a significant level of recognition within the British sphere. Now, he was eventually recognized as Qaim Maqam by the Ottomans. And in fact, in 1913, there would be a treaty that would attempt to bring Mubarak bin Sabah as-Sabah further into the Ottoman aegis. But of course, 1913 was a year before World War I began. And accordingly, when the British and the Ottomans became enemies in that conflict, Kuwait was on the British side. Now, starting in 1891, we remember that Abdurrahman Saud was forced into hiding by the Rashidis, and he spent some time in the Trucial States, some time in Qatar, but eventually he ended up settling by the end of the year in Kuwait, where he had the support of Mubarak as-Sabah. And Abdulaziz, his son, grew up in the court of Mubarak, and the two of them were relatively close. In fact, so close that when Kuwait decided to test whether or not they could become the dominant power in Arabia by conquering the Rashidis in 1901, Abdulaziz bin Saud was permitted to bring his own contingent of what we can anachronistically call Saudis to fight alongside. In fact, those Saudis took a different path. You can see that green arrow that diverges from the red arrow, and tried to capture Riyadh, which they were actually successful in doing. They had to give it back afterwards, though, because the Kuwaitis lost the Battle of As-Sarif. Now, the Battle of As-Sarif was so devastating to the Kuwaitis that it looked like Mubarak as-Safah might actually lose his power. And the British were considering replacing him with Sheikh Khaz'al bin Jabir al-Ka'bi from Arabistan in modern-day Iran, the region of Khuzestan today. But Khaz'al basically said that Mubarak was his kinsman and that he couldn't see himself replacing him. Ultimately, Mubarak was able to pull everything together and was able to keep Kuwait from falling apart. But this established the relationship between Kuwait and Abdulaziz bin Saud, who's probably going to take up the rest of our time today. So, following this war in 1901, Abdulaziz bin Saud was not very happy. By the way, I'm going to call him Ibn Saud for the rest of the night. Ibn Saud is how he's commonly referred to in English, but his full name is Abdulaziz bin Abdurrahman as-Saud. So Ibn Saud had that taste of taking Riyadh, the historic capital of his family, and so he couldn't let it go. So in January of 1902, he went to Masmak Fort, which was the fortress protecting Riyadh, and in the middle of the night, he and 40 men felled a date palm, used the date palm to scale the walls, and overran the fortress. And so at the beginning of 1902, there he is at the city of Riyadh. And after he took the city, Mubarak as-Sabah gave him a gift of 80 men to further improve his odds. Now, Jabal Shamar was a vassal state of the Ottomans. They had done the bay'ah, and so Ottoman soldiers responded to Jabal Shamar's request to put down this insurrection in Riyadh. In the first engagements in the battle, the Ottomans dealt a devastating blow to Ibn Saud, and so what he decided to do was to use a number of supply route attacks, avoiding facing the Ottomans head-on and instead going for local clashes. This actually worked. The Ottomans decided to withdraw from the region and gave Ibn Saud the title of Qaimakam of the region of Nejd, which put him on par with the Rashidis of Jabal Shamar, and was effectively the recognition of his power. In 1907, the Rashidis were relented, and the two of them split that region together. Now, elsewhere within the Ottoman Empire, you had a massive shift in 1908 with the Young Turk Revolution. And while the Young Turk Revolution had a number of effects, in the Arab world, probably the strongest effect was the Turkification. And we've talked about this before, that you had the Rushdiya schools and schools throughout the Ottoman territories in the upper Middle East to compel Arabs to speak Turkish and read and write Turkish. And we've also talked about that in the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance, you have a number of authors, especially in Lebanon and in Egypt, who are working to create a new Arab nationalism or a new Islamic modernism. Both of these ideologies vastly different from what we see in Arabia. And in fact, these ideologies don't apply in Arabia, which kind of seems ironic, but Arab nationalism never really catches on in the Arabian Peninsula until the 1960s in Yemen. And we're not covering that today. So if we remember from our discussion of the Middle East theaters of World War I, which was episode 45, we've got 5 major theaters of World War I. And really the one that matters is the Arab Revolt. And so, but before we can talk about the Arab Revolt, just to remember, Mubarak ibn Sabah al-Sabah helps the British land at Fao, which is a fortress that guards the entrance to Ottoman Iraq. And he helped the British disembark and fought some of the initial campaigns with them before letting them go to Kut al-Amara, where the British suffered immense casualties and losses. But excluding that, Arabia had really nothing to do with any of the other 4 theaters of the conflict. Almost all of the conflict dealt with what was happening in Arabia itself. Now, starting in 1902, but really solidifying by 1912, was what were called the Ikhwan. The Ikhwan means the brotherhood, and as a result of these Bedouin who had been sedentarized to a degree and taught Wahhabism, they became incredibly religiously passionate to the point of zealotry, and they were known as raiders. They would go to villages that did not profess Wahhabi Islam, attack them, subdue them, and bring them into territory controlled by Ibn Saud. In fact, these were a critical element of the war against Jabal Shamar from 1902 to 1907. Now, as Ibn Saud was becoming more powerful and without the issue of dealing with Jabal Shamar, he approached the British, and the British were not interested in anything from him, primarily because he had no access to the sea. But that would change as World War I got closer and closer. In particular, a British statesman named William Shakespeare, no relation, was involved with courting Ibn Saud and convincing him to join with the allies of World War I against the Ottoman Empire. Now, Jabal Shamar, as we remember, is a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. So the way that Ibn Saud would fight against the Ottomans would be to attack his old enemy Jabal Shamar, which of course Ibn Saud would do without asking. He was covetous of that territory. He had his Ikhwan raiders. He was in a much better position than he had been in 1902. And the British were even willing to sweeten the pot for him with an annual stipend. At first, in 1915, he received £20,000. Every year after that, he received £60,000. And this was because he signed with Percy Cox the Treaty of Darin. And Darin is a small island in the Persian Gulf where this treaty was signed. The reason that the British signed this treaty was to demarcate the lands that belonged to those British protectorates they had already created. We've talked about the Trucial States in Oman. We haven't talked about Aden yet, but Aden was also demarcated here. And Kuwait. But the irony, of course, is that by demarcating those areas that Ibn Saud was not responsible for, it legitimized his ability to take those areas that were not in that territory. So this worked out quite well for him. William Shakespeare accompanied Ibn Saud as a military attaché in his first interaction with the Rashidi clan. And that went horribly. William Shakespeare was killed in the battle, and Ibn Saud was largely ignored for the rest of the war. The reason he was ignored was that T. Lawrence thought that it would be better for the British to pursue a relationship with the Sharif of Mecca, one of the rulers on the Hijazi side. And in particular, the Sharif at that time was Hussein bin Ali Hashemi. And that was the man who they decided to court. Now, the rest of the Arab Revolt occurs, and the Arab Revolt is primarily directed by Hussein bin Ali Hashemi, and the Saudis stay out of the war beyond their disagreements with the Rashidis in the early period. So you have Versailles, and the Saudis want to send a representative. This representative is not received. He is told quite specifically that he is not relevant. And of course, the Sharif of Mecca is allowed to send a representative on behalf of the Arabs. And that's, of course, the future King Faisal the First of Iraq. And when the British and French divide the Middle East into mandates, those mandates exist at that time north of any territory that the Saudis controlled. Remember, north of them in the center of the country is Jabal Shamar, in the west of the country is Hejaz, and in the east of the country is Kuwait. So at that point, they have no borders with these mandates. Additionally, those mandates were not meant to cover any part of Arabia, because that would eventually be part of the states held by the Sharif of Mecca and his children. Because of the way the Treaty of Versailles humiliated the Sharif of Mecca, in the sense of he was not given that vast Arab state that he was promised. He believed that under the Hussein McMahon Correspondence of 1915, that he would be able to control practically all of the Middle East, except some coastal territory in what's today Lebanon and Syria. But of course, the mandates meant that he didn't control most of this territory. Saud, however, Ibn Saud didn't have this problem. He was rejected from Versailles, and therefore his opposition to it was perfectly moral. He decided to use the British stipend that he was still receiving. He would not actually stop receiving a stipend until 1927. To purchase more and more British arms, and then he directed his vengeance against Jabal Shamar, which you can see on the map on the lower right-hand side in that light orange color. By 1921, he had overcome the city of Al-Ha'il, which is the capital city of Jabal Shamar, and Jabal Shamar was annexed to his new state. Increasingly, he was coming closer and closer to territories that the British wanted to control. He also invaded territory of Kuwait, and this got the attention of Percy Cox, who was a British attaché for the Middle East. And in the city of Al-Qair, he had a new treaty signed in 1922, formalizing the new boundaries of the Saudi state. And those boundaries would be set at the edges of the mandates that had been given to the British for Iraq and for Jordan. Now, this, of course, was deeply offensive to the Ikhwan, right? These Ikhwan believed that all non-believers, and by non-believers, we are including Sunni Muslims here, all non-believers need to be part of the Wahhabi state. And therefore, we start to see some tension developing between Ibn Saud, who wants to respect his relationship with the British, the relationship that's providing him the financial security to run the state that he is, and the Ikhwan, who are giving him the military ability to acquire more and more territory. And for a while, he avoids attacking Hejaz, and he avoids attacking Hejaz until 1924, because he is always looking after the British. He's trying to maintain his alliance with the British, and Hejaz is being ruled by the Sharif of Mecca, who is now also supported by the British. Now, the Sharif of Mecca and Ibn Saud would be antagonistic to each other, regardless of the fact that there was antipathy towards the way the British had treated one versus the other. In 1912, the Sharif had invited Sa'ad bin Abdurrahman. Sa'ad bin Abdurrahman is Ibn Saud's brother, and he'd invited him to discuss a peace treaty. But this discussion was a trap, and Sa'ad was taken captive. In order to get him back, in order to get him back, Ibn Saud had to sign a bay'ah with the Ottoman Empire at the time, because this was 1912. And after signing the bay'ah, he also had to give tribute, which of course was humiliating and drove a wedge between them. The Ikhwan raided across the border in 1918 in what's been known as the Turaba incident, but Ibn Saud tried to check the Ikhwan to prevent them from doing it ever again. But in 1924, the situation changed drastically. What ended up happening is that in the Ottoman Empire, the caliphate was abolished. Sorry, in now the Turkish Republic, the caliphate was abolished by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. We talked about that 2 weeks ago, episode 50. And as a result, the Sharif of Mecca, who had proclaimed during the war that he was the king of the Arabs, which of course incensed Ibn Saud because he considered himself king of the Arabs as well, Sharif Hussein declared himself the Caliph of Islam, inheriting the role that had been played by Abdul Majid II in the Ottoman Empire. Now, Ibn Saud disrespected this claim, as did many Muslims around the world, and so the Ikhwan decided to lead an attack against the Sharif of Mecca, which Ibn Saud condoned, and that started in late 1924 and continued into early 1925. The first cities to fall were in the south, with Mecca under siege, and then a second prong got to Medina. With both of those cities about to fall, the Sharif surrendered all of the Hejaz to Ibn Saud and his Ikhwan. Now, the Ikhwan were increasingly becoming a problem as we turn to 1927, because they failed to recognize Transjordan Iraq and British garrisons throughout Saudi territory as being legitimate. Remember their belief on the subject. And so they began to rebel, led by Sultan bin Bajad al-Utaybi. There are two camps of people in terms of what their motivations are, and there may well be a mixture of the two of them. The first is that there was a religious motivation, the one that we discussed, that Ibn Saud was no longer an effective caretaker of the Wahhabi regime. He was violating Wahhabi values to permit the continued existence of non-believers in traditional Arab lands and preventing the expansion of the Wahhabi state in all directions. The other one was perhaps a terrestrial motivation. If Ibn Saud coalesced his territory and there were no longer any areas to attack, then their power would probably be lessened within that state. And so in order to maintain their historic privilege, they would need to fight to retain the state as it was. Now, Ibn Saud reached out to his British allies to have some help in putting down the Ikhwan rebellion. And the British provided both manpower, but more importantly, they provided machines. One of the distinctions that Ibn Saud made between himself and the Ikhwan is that he believed in modern technology and that the Europeans could provide this modern technology. So he allied with the British in order to create a military force of tanks that could overrun the Ikhwan, and four British pilots flew over and dropped bombs on the Ikhwan raiders, of course, resulting in a rout because there was no real way for the Ikhwan to repel this air power. At the Battle of Sabila, in March of 1929, the rebellion was mostly put down. There were some stragglers that continued until 1930, and Sultan bin Bajad al-Utaybi was taken prisoner, and he died in captivity. Now, if we shift our focus a little bit towards Yemen, in the 18th century, there was the port of Mocha. Its location on the map you can see sort of in the small circle with nothing inside of it. That's where the port of Mocha is. In Arabic, of course, it's Mocha. But of course, and that's the name where the coffee comes from, because the plant is originally from that region. Now, Mocha was a very desirable port, but the British, despite trying to negotiate with the Zaydi Imamate, were not able to get a lease for it. The British were, however, able to convince the Sultan of Lahej to permit the British to trade at the port of Aden. And wouldn't you know that when the British arrived in Aden in 1839, they got attacked by a local population that didn't want to trade with them. Seeing this as a legitimate casus belli, the British India Company sent their own expedition led by Captain Haynes. And this expedition arrived in Aden, took the city. There were fights by 1,000 Yemeni who tried to resist, and the British put them down. The British realized quite quickly that if they wanted to use Aden as a port, they would need to be able to secure the surrounding area and make peace with the 9 Arab tribes that surrounded it. And so, using the hard-won tactic of diplomacy at the point of a gun, they got these tribal leaders to sign the agreement. And later they got many more of these Yemeni tribes south of the Zaydi Imamate to sign along the dotted line. Now, British colonial policy in South Yemen was later established by paying ransoms to these tribal leaders and allowing them to enforce law as they saw fit, which plunged Yemen into poverty that it did not escape until the British were ejected in the 1960s. It's been said that the British did not spend a single dime on any infrastructural improvements, but they spent a significant amount in keeping those warlords empowered. Now, we talked about the south, it's worth talking about the north. So we mentioned that there was a Zaydi Imamate. So what does that mean? The Zaydi are a group of Shiites who split off after the 5th Imam. I talked about this a little bit in the 4th episode in the series. Now, the Zaydis, by and large, don't exist anywhere else in the world. There used to be Zaydis in Morocco. For example, the Idrisids of Morocco were Zaydi. But by this time in history, the Zaydis really only exist in that northern part of Yemen, and they're led by an imam or spiritual leader who also uses a certain degree of political power. That said, as the Ottomans moved south into the region, they cut some of the power away from the imam and respected him only as a spiritual leader. Imam Yahya of the Mutawakkil branch wanted to change this. And so starting in 1904, he began to assert more and more power against the Ottoman governor. And that governor in 1911 was Ahmed Izzet Furgach. Then he got that surname later under the surname law of 1934. But he signed in 1911 the Treaty of Da'an, whose purpose was to grant significant autonomy to Imam Yahya in order to run his Mutawakkilite state. Imam Yahya's reign was one of consolidating a number of disparate regions and hills, a bunch of disparate regions and neighborhoods that had previously been subject to different Yemeni warlords and other individuals. By and large, the communities of Yemen that were under his rule were supportive, particularly the Jewish minority, which, while still repressed under his rule, was significantly less so than it had been under the previous warlord style of governance that had prevailed during the Ottoman period. In particular, Rabbi Yahya Yitzhak Halawi became one of the chief rabbis and advised Imam Yahya on Jewish policy, even securing, despite a general requirement that Jews not leave the country or emigrate to Israel, permission for several Zionists to visit the country. You can see Shmuel Yadnaeli, who visited the country during that period, and that Imam Yahya would ignore if Jews left the country, failing to effectively police his borders intentionally. Yahya also improved the situation for the general citizenry as well. One of his first major achievements was the banning of weapons within the city of Sana'a, which is the capital of Yemen. And because of this, he was able to keep the country relatively safe and unified. So, despite this, however, there was conflict brewing between the now expansive Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The two parties had tried to split the region of Al-Sayr, with that region effectively falling to the Saudis later. But there was a zone that was undemarcated between the northern reach of the Mutawakkilites area and Saudi Arabia. Now, this led to the British and Italians further taking sides in this conflict. The Italians really valued Yahya as a potential trading ally. Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, those two colonies in light green, were very difficult colonies for Italy to maintain. They had not developed an economic power base that could sustain it, and the trade with Yemen could hopefully revitalize those economies. Additionally, the British seem to control everything around their colonies. You can see that pink everywhere, and the British relationship with the Saudis. So by having another ally in the region, it would keep the British from having a full stranglehold on the area. On the flip side, the British were looking at this situation as possibly being a problem for them maintaining the border between the Mutawakkilite area in the north and their confederation of Yemeni statelets in the south. And the British also had a number of hostages that were taken in 1928 that they wanted returned by this time in 1934. But ultimately, the British were afraid of stability issues in Europe as a result of this. In fact, the British had supported the independence of the Asir region as a way to thwart Mutawakkilite aims on Aden and the taking of those territories away from the British. So to test his luck, the Mutawakkilite emir invaded this undemarcated zone, taking the cities of Najran and Hajra, along with several others, into his territory in November of 1933. In the following March, after numerous attempts at negotiation, Ibn Saud ordered the invasion of that zone to bring it under Saudi control. Throughout March and June, April, and May, the Saudis made significant progress, even blockading the city of Sana'a in the heart of Mutawakkilite Yemen, and taking the port city of Hodeidah, which they eventually returned after the war. They followed this by signing the Treaty of Taif, and the Treaty of Taif resulted in Yemen being formally demarcated with these new borders set, and Saudi Arabia finishing its expansionary process with a truce that would last for 20 years. So following this, we have effectively the creation of Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia isn't really united in the sense of having one government. In fact, it's separated into the governments of Hejaz and Nejd that would only really start to be united in the 1940s and 50s. Hejaz is given to one viceroy, Nejd to another. Both these are sons of Ibn Saud. And Hejaz is run according to an Ottoman-style bureaucracy. There's a Majlis Ashura, which is a legislative council. But conversely, Nejd is run as a traditional situation where there is what's called the daily Majlis, where the ruler allows any citizen to come up to him with grievances that he must address. And while this works in a tribal society, it doesn't work in a large nation. And there had to be a balance between the traditional elements and more modern elements. There also had to be balance between the religious zealotry of the Wahhabis and the fact that the Qatif region had a large number of Shiites in it. So in order to keep power centralized, what ended up happening is that lateral succession was formalized, meaning that Abdulaziz's children would succeed him in power, but none of their children would succeed them. So as you see, all the kings, all the way up until today, are all Ibn Saud's sons, which are getting increasingly older as time goes on. Mohammed bin Salman only is reigning now in Saudi Arabia as the crown prince because of an edict by King Salman. Another issue was that there were different branches of the family and that those branches might try to take power. So in order to stop this, and also to reward them for loyalty, as well as the loyalty of those who are not directly in the House of Saud, he gave them governorships and advisorships so that they would have localized power that they could spread to their children, but never national power that could compete with the power in Riyadh. Saudi Arabia at this point becomes a nation in desperate need of cash. And it becomes in desperate need of cash in the 1930s because as the Great Depression sets in, fewer and fewer people are going abroad on the Hajj. So what ends up happening is that after World War I, in 1920, there's a conference called the San Remo Conference. And at the San Remo Conference, they have what is a number of other agreements. They have the San Remo Oil Agreement, which establishes the Turkish Petroleum Company, which is owned in several parts by British associations, French associations, and Calouste Gulbenkian, who is a British Armenian who walked away with 5% of the oil revenues, incredibly wealthy. And he used that money to amass one of the largest art collections that has ever been assembled by a private person. But back to Saudi Arabia. So because of this Turkish Petroleum Company, all of the areas of the former Ottoman Empire were redlined. It was even called the Red Line Agreement as a subsequent agreement. Those territories were redlined, and that only the members of the Turkish Petroleum Company could extract that oil. Accordingly, American companies that felt excluded were looking elsewhere for oil. And in 1932, on the island of Bahrain, the Standard Oil of California, which is the ancestor of today's Chevron, discovered oil in Bahrain. They thought that there might be oil in Saudi Arabia as well. And so in 1933, they purchased a concession to look in the area near the Haram in order to see if they could find oil. And the area that they looked in is the area in that red circle. For 4 years, from 1934 until 1938, they kept looking. And just as they were about to pull the funding at the oil well called Dammam number 7, which has since been called Lucky Dammam number 7, they hit oil. And not only did they hit oil, they hit a vein large enough to produce hundreds of barrels per day, which more than justified the cost of investigation. Now, oil investigation was also a point of tension between Ibn Saud and the Wahhabi clerics. They had been opposed to a number of both the presence of non-Arabs in Arabia and modern technologies, seeing them as anathema to Islam. But Ibn Saud desperately needed the revenue in order to fund the state. And so he managed to convince them of the acceptability of this, provided that the Saudis would be part of the process. Ibn Saud also was responsible for the integration of numerous other technologies like the telephone, and by convincing the Wahhabi clerics that it could be used for the purpose of promoting Islam. In fact, the first telephone conversation in Saudi Arabia was Ibn Saud calling to read out verses of the Quran. In 1944, Standard Oil of California reorganized within the territory of Saudi Arabia as Aramco, the Arab American Oil Company, the Arab American Company. And Aramco in 1950 was compelled by Ibn Saud to allow Saudis to buy in at 50%. And so 50% of the profits of Aramco after 1950 belong to the Al Saud family. So we got to the end. All right. Questions, comments, concerns, put those in the chat. In the meantime, while you're formulating those questions, I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about our group, History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard Sassoon, and I run the Middle Eastern Islamic History section. Our next discussion will be on October 13th, because I am taking a few weeks off. But when we return that night, we're going to be talking about the Levant under French control. That's Syria and Lebanon from 1920 until World War II. And then from that point on, we'll proceed weekly. There are also other groups there that are discussing things like language, arms and armor, powerful women, European Union security, which I host jointly with Aaron Reyes. We'll probably have an episode of that in November. Asian philosophy and Greco-Roman philosophy, which are every week on Saturday and Monday nights, respectively. And we also have several short-run series, like our Islam 101 series. In fact, this weekend, we are going to have a presentation by Nurul about his Hajj to Mecca, which is oddly apropos given what the discussion we just had. There's also a discussion about the Russo-Ukrainian war. We're going to touch back about that on the 2nd of October. So a lot of really great stuff. And of course, we have even older series. All of this is up on our YouTube page. So questions, comments, concerns. If you prefer to speak your question, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you. I hope I got to your question, Sophia, about how the Sykes-Picot line impacted Saudi Arabia's geography. It basically constrained it on the northern side. And ironically, the king of Jordan today is the only ruling descendant of the Sharif of Mecca, despite the fact that the Sharif's son ruled in the Hejaz from 1924 until 1926. And Faisal ruled in Syria in 1920. And then the last kings of Iraq were overthrown in 1958. I have a comment here that I'd want to talk about a little bit. The comment is, from the standpoint of a philosophical anthropology or theological anthropology, the Quran is a return to divinely mandated laws or commandments contained in the 5 books of Moses. This is the basis of the conflict between Western civilization and the Islamic world, in my opinion. I have to get, I don't know that I agree. I think that the conflict between the Islamic world and the Western world is primarily engendered by specific strains of expansionism in the Western world and by ideological purism in the Islamic world. And so where those two things meet is where we have a lot of the conflict. As you can see from today's episode, you have a number of cases where you have Ibn Saud, who is clearly an adherent of an extreme version of Islam, but he is aligning his view with that of the colonizers. And conversely, you have people like the Zaydi Imam, who is religious but traditional, and his views are in direct contrast with those of the British. The same with so there's a comment, apparently there will be a water shortage in Saudi Arabia in 2030, so it will be interesting to see how they recalibrate. The Red Sea is okay. There are different oceans and seas in the world, and some of them lose water to evaporation at a greater rate than it's replenished by rivers and streams. The Red Sea is one of those. The Mediterranean is also one of those, right? If somebody filled in the Strait of Gibraltar somehow, right, and just plugged it up, the Mediterranean Sea would become a salt lake, and then it would just evaporate completely. There's less water going into the Mediterranean Sea by the rivers than evaporates out, and the Red Sea is the same way. So there's a significant amount of water that flows in from the Bab al-Mandeb, which is the small strait that separates Yemen from Eritrea. And desalination is increasing the rate of water removal from the Red Sea. So it will be interesting to see how that's recalibrated. The other thing is that the city of Neom, in terms of its construction, will need a large amount of water and will have to pull that water from the Red Sea. So there's a lot of work to see how more water can be added to the Red Sea. And if there's either pulling it through the Suez Canal or some other method should work. But it's a difficult question. And as I'm not a hydrologist, I couldn't answer that. I'm sorry. Aaron, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, it's fantastic presentation. I mean, I put an article in. I can put a few more on the YouTube when you guys upload it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's it's one of the least understood future states or states now that's developed in the last 300 years. And I think one thing I would encourage people to do is look at the GCC now as an evolution from all of these individual states, especially from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, through the oil crisis, because most people aren't aware that the GCC now is the nominal GDP is over 3 trillion for the GCC now. So, and it's pretty rapidly diversifying, right? I mean, the traditional view that it's just a great big gas station, which was absolutely true for half a century. It's just not as true anymore. I mean, they're becoming especially within the region, banking, engineering, infrastructure, sort of superpower, and especially when you look at the larger bilaterals that they have, which I think most people believe at some point you can see a GCC sort of Israel, Turkey kind of blend up for various economic trade drivers. So I just think the Saudi, everyone have counted the Saudis out for a long time, and they are pretty resilient state basically at this point.
Absolutely. One of the things I didn't mention, but you sort of brought up, is this diversification that we're seeing in the Gulf states. And during World War I, the British wanted an air route to India. And so they began building airstrips in Dubai and in Sharjah in order to facilitate that. And of course, those airstrips became the antecedents for the modern airports and the modern thought process in Dubai and Abu Dhabi for using their location to create these massive airlines that connect Europe and Asia. So even at this early point, we can see the slow ideas of diversification taking root there, because they can see what the British are using their territories for, and how they can effectively restructure that. And so that's why you see banking, which of course is a very traditional British money producing activity, and yeah, they're taking their cue from Britain. And there's a certain degree to which there's this attempt to traditionalize it, where the GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council, is instituting things like Islamic banking, or they're trying to restrict physical manifestations of romance on the streets, because of traditional atmospheres. But generally speaking, it's very quickly moving in the direction of emulating the British, rather than trying to remove their influence. All right. I think with that, we can close this out, and I'll see everybody for our next Middle East session in 4 weeks, 3 weeks vacation, 4th week we come back, and that will be the 13th of October. And I look forward to seeing everybody, of course, at our next Ukraine live stream, which will be 11 o'clock on the 2nd of October, Eastern time. And we'll talk about all these incredible recent victories that Ukraine has been scoring in the region near Kharkiv. All right. Bye, everybody.